There is a small detail buried in the Book of Jubilees, but if it's true, it could change the way you understand Eden, Adam, and the very nature of humanity. Jubilees 3:15 to 17 records. They lived in the Garden of Eden for 7 full years, tending it and guarding it, eating joyfully and not transgressing a single commandment. 7 years, not a fleeting moment, not just a few days before the fall, but a complete, sacred, stable span of time lived in the light. 7 years between Adam, Eve, and the Creator. No separation, no darkness in the soul, no whispering serpent, only the presence of God, the guardian angels, and a world singing the words of life. So, if they once lived 7 full years in the light, why did they still fall? If they had been taught the law, had kept the Sabbath, had known clearly what was holy and what was dangerous, then why did they lose it all? What really happened during those 7 years, and what began to fade as the 8th year arrived? It wasn't Eden that changed. Something inside them began to dim. Perhaps it wasn't a sudden stumble, but a slow fading of memory, a forgetting of who they once were. And the greater question is this: if they once lived like that, could something of that light still remain within you? This story does not begin at the forbidden tree. It begins in a long season where divine light and sacred law coexisted. A season we have forgotten and must remember. Today, we re-enter Eden, not the place with the serpent, but the place still shining. The place before any lies had been spoken, where only the music of the evening flowed down from God. And perhaps on this journey, you may recover something that Adam and Eve once held and then lost. Eden is not merely an earthly garden. In the Book of Jubilees, it appears as a sacred land carefully prepared by God, not for human pleasure, but for instruction, for training, and for maturity in the light. Every day in Eden was a lesson. Every creature, every river, every passing moment was a symbol crafted for a holy purpose. Nothing in Eden was random. Adam and Eve were placed there as the first disciples of humanity, not as innocent children, but as souls beginning to walk in the order of the cosmos. Jubilees describes that they were taught to keep the Sabbath, not just as a rule, but as a rhythm in harmony with the breath of God. They understood the language of creation, not merely to name the animals, but to recognize that life is a flowing spiritual connection. And they remembered the law, not out of fear of punishment, but to live in the nature they were entrusted with. Eden in Jubilees is not a refuge, but an academy of the soul. And Adam, Eve were not merely residents, but the first students of life. In the stillness of the sacred garden, they were not only loved, they were prepared, not for indulgence, but for a deep dialogue between freedom and faithfulness, between light and darkness. And it is there the true story of humanity begins. In the popular view, Eden is a lawless place, a land of absolute freedom where humans lived innocently like children, unaware of good and evil. But the Book of Jubilees presents a radically different picture. The law was there from the beginning, and more than that, the law was the heart of Eden, the axis that kept the light burning, the harmony intact, and the human soul on course. Jubilees not only affirms that Adam and Eve were taught the law, but shows that they practiced it specifically, keeping the Sabbath, distinguishing between clean and unclean animals, understanding the ritual calendar in its sacred cycles. They did not live in naivete, they lived within a conscious order, directly guided by God through his angels. This completely shifts how we understand the innocent time. Innocence was not ignorance of right and wrong, it was knowing and choosing rightly. Eden was not a place without limits. It was a place where limits were loved, explained, and lived as a form of communion with God. And if the law was there from the beginning, then the fall was not merely a careless mistake, but a deviation from the central axis. Not because they didn't know, but because the light of the law within them began to fade. Here, Jubilees presents a profound theology. Law is not a tool to punish, but a structure by which the soul lives according to the image it was created in. Law is not the boundary of freedom, but the frame in which freedom blossoms within divine order. Adam knew he was living within a covenant, and Eve understood that every action, every choice, resonated with the heartbeat of creation. That is not naivete. That is a heightened awareness of God's presence, not only through the light, but through every commandment engraved in their hearts. Eden was not just a garden, it was a temple, and the law was the breath of that sanctuary. In the Book of Jubilees, time is not a vague flow, but a sacred structure, divided into clear cycles, weeks, sabbatical years, and the 49-year Jubilees. Every unit of time bears divine significance, marked by the presence of God, and serves as a measure of human faithfulness. So what happened when Adam and Eve lived the first full 7 years in Eden, before the fall? Jubilees 3:15-17 records that they lived in the garden for 7 years, tended it, kept the laws, and did not transgress a single command. This is not a random number. 7 years, according to the structure of Jubilees, is the foundational unit of sacred time. It is a mini-Jubilee, a complete small cycle where life, divine law, and covenant are in harmony. Through this lens, Eden is no longer a fleeting moment before sin, but becomes a primordial pattern of time lived rightly, where God is present. Mankind keeps the law, and the universe sings in communion. Each year in Eden was not just time passing, it was a step in spiritual maturity. Those 7 years, in the logic of Jubilees, were a preparation, like the land resting during a Sabbath year to be renewed, like a soul being trained before facing its trial. Seen this way, Eden is not a paradise lost in a flash, but a meaningful period of training, fully lived, consecrated by sacred time, and only after that cycle ended did the testing begin. And perhaps that is why the loss did not come at once, but at the right time, after a complete cycle. As with everything in the Book of Jubilees, nothing is random. Every marker of time signals a sacred transition. And if you can see those 7 years as a small jubilee, you will see Eden is not just a memory. It is a model, a pattern of light, so that anyone still living within time can live again within the covenant. 7 years in Eden were not a time of stillness. They were a progression, a quiet unfolding recorded in the Book of Jubilees, where each passing day marked a step in spiritual growth. Adam and Eve did not simply sit in a beautiful garden. They lived, but lived as disciples. They were taught, they learned. They were led into depths that today we can only vaguely sense through symbols long lost. They learned to speak the language of the creatures, not the external sounds, but the sound of the soul. They named not by whim, but by essence. When Adam looked upon a creature and called its name, it was a moment when human soul and creation met, and words became covenant. They tended the garden, not merely with hands, but with hearts that listened. Every young tree planted was an act of worship. Every stream of water poured was a spoken blessing. Eden was not a garden made for man, but a shared temple of life. And Adam, in the Book of Jubilees, was its keeper, not to rule over it, but to guard the sacred. Each evening, as the dew descended, the footsteps of God could be heard. They did not hide, but came forth. That sound was not a call from afar, but the heartbeat of the Creator walking among those he loved. And they heard it, not with their ears, but with the light within their souls. The angels were not distant, they were present, quiet teachers. They taught rituals, they taught sacrifice, they taught how to count time by the sacred calendar. Adam knew what the Sabbath was. Eve knew which day began a new cycle. They lived in a stream of time not out of sync, but aligned with heaven's rhythm. Those 7 years were not mere existence. They were a sacred journey, without sin, but full of practice, without darkness, but with challenge in the light. And the mystery is this: no journal records the days, only a quiet affirmation in Jubilees that they lived and kept every word. That is Eden, not a place, but a process, a prelude of the soul before the greatest test arrived, a lesson we once lived and perhaps still remember. 7 years in the light were not only a blessing, but a preparation. Like a soul being formed, step by step into strength, Adam and Eve were taught by God not merely to live, but to choose. Not to choose in the dark, but to choose in the fullness of light. And when the 8th year came, something shifted. Not the garden, not God, but a quiet door opened. The door of trial. Jubilees does not say the fall was an accident. It was a turning point permitted to occur at the appointed time. God did not bring temptation into Eden, but he allowed freedom to be tested. At the moment, faithfulness had ripened. The test did not come as a shout, but as a whisper. It did not force, but suggested. It did not push, but opened another possibility. What if one chose a path outside the light? And that is why the story of Eden is not a sudden tragedy. It is a gradual trembling within the soul, like a stringed instrument perfectly tuned for 7 years, beginning to go out of tune with the first moment of self-doubt. There was no alarm, no storm, only silence slightly longer than usual, only a footstep that lingered near a tree once quietly passed by, only a different kind of look, where the light in the eyes began to flicker. The test did not come from outside, but from within. After 7 years, Adam and Eve were no longer only led, they were granted the power to choose. And in that very freedom, darkness was permitted to appear, not to destroy, but to reveal. Would the light entrusted to them be kept? Jubilees does not describe the fall in detail, but by emphasizing 7 years of faithfulness, it shows us the breaking did not come suddenly. It came after a long time, when a soul that knew everything could still forget who it was. And in that 8th year, Eden did not change. But the human heart began to tremble to a new rhythm. A rhythm where the light was no longer guarded, but taken for granted. That is when the true test began. In most tellings, the fall of Adam and Eve is portrayed as a simple act, eating the forbidden fruit, a mistake, a moment of disobedience. But according to Jubilees and the deep theology of ancient texts, that is only the surface. The deeper reality did not begin with an action, but with a silent process, forgetting. They were not naive. They had been taught. They had lived 7 years in the light. They understood the law. They kept the Sabbath. They heard the voice of God. They lacked no knowledge. They lacked sacred memory. That memory was not in the mind, but in the soul. It was the remembrance of being made of light. The deep knowing that they were not merely allowed to live, but entrusted with an order to uphold. The inner awareness that every breath reflected a higher being. And when the forgetting began, there was no bell, no grand sign, just a subtle thought. Did he really say? And just one evening when they did not rise as the footsteps of God came, just one glance at the tree, no longer seeing warning, but another promise, you will be like God. Jubilees does not highlight the seduction, it focuses on the fading of the inner light. The fall did not come from rebellion, but from disorientation. Not because temptation was too strong, but because the light within the soul was no longer cherished. Here lies the theological shock. Sin is not just a wrong act. It is the result of forgetting one's origin, forgetting that you are a child of light, forgetting that freedom is meant to live rightly, not to test what is wrong. And from forgetting comes doubt. From doubt comes desire. From desire comes action. And that action, in its deepest essence, was not the hand reaching for fruit, but the moment a soul no longer saw itself as the image of God. The fall began when light was no longer named each day, when divine law was no longer upheld as life itself, when living rightly became a choice instead of a nature. Adam and Eve did not fall from ignorance. They stumbled because they ceased to remember who they had been, and that is the true fall, the loss of sacred memory, a loss that no one took, but that they let go of themselves. In Jubilees 3:29, there is an image so painful and sacred it grips the soul. And the light in their eyes went out, and they looked upon each other, and saw only flesh. It's not that they had never seen each other before. They had lived together for 7 years, but this was the first time they no longer saw each other's soul. That did not come from the act. It came from a shift deep within. Before the fig leaf covered their skin, something else was veiled first, the light from within. And once that light went out, everything changed. No more transparency, no more reflection, no more seeing each other by light, but by fleshly eyes. The gaze changed, and the world changed with it. Before, every look was a blessing. Now, every look was a question. Before, they had nothing to hide. Now, they dared not be seen. Not because God had departed, but because they no longer saw each other the same. Jubilees does not describe blood. It doesn't recount physical pain. It simply, silently reveals a more terrifying truth. The light vanished from the human gaze, and from there, everything around them began to fade. The language of the creatures grew foreign. The music in the wind went still. The understanding of all things dissolved into emptiness. They were not first cast out of Eden. They were first separated from each other, not judged by a word, but by the extinguishing of a glance. And have you ever known that moment? A time when someone you love looked at you but no longer saw you. A moment when you looked into your own mirror and could no longer recognize the deepest part of yourself. That is the experience of Eden when the light goes out. Not a dark night, but the hush after the light. A cold emptiness when a soul loses the gaze of God and of one another. And the deepest sorrow was not that they saw themselves naked, but that they saw nothing beyond the surface. They were still Adam and Eve, but they were no longer each other's light, and that was the true beginning of the separation, not spoken, but seen in a gaze that was no longer sacred. Eden was not closed as a sudden punishment. It did not shut with iron gates or thunder. According to Jubilees and the deeper biblical tradition, Eden withdrew, faded from the reach of a soul without light. That place was not taken away. It became incompatible with the state of fallen humanity. For 7 years, Adam and Eve lived in the overlap of heaven and earth, where their souls were still transparent, still reflecting perfectly the light of the Creator. But once that light inside them dimmed, not only did their vision change, the sacred dimension around them also began to shift. The trees no longer sang. The rivers no longer gleamed like crystal. The fragrance of Eden that once soothed the soul began to fade, as if the world around them knew that the ones within had lost their sacred harmony. Jubilees hints at a profound truth. Sacred space does not exist apart from the soul's condition. When the soul drifts from the orbit of light, nature, space, and the breath of the cosmos shift with it. Eden did not change, but Adam and Eve could no longer remain. Not because God pushed them out, but because their very nature no longer resonated with the holiness of that place. It was not just a loss of a home. It was the loss of the ability to dwell in a higher dimension. Eden, a place where truth and light converged, could not hold a soul that had forgotten who it was. And so the gate closed, not by judgment's hand, but by the difference in essence between the place and its inhabitant. Just as a detuned instrument cannot remain in the orchestra, a soul without light cannot continue to resound in Eden's sacred song. That closing, silent, piercing, and holy, was a bloodless death, a parting without rage, but the inevitable result of a loss of harmony between the inner being and the universe. Eden did not close to punish, but to preserve the sanctity of those who still carried light enough to remain. And from there, mankind stepped into another space, no longer transparent, no longer singing, but only memory, and the longing to return. After all, after the light in their eyes went out, after Eden closed like a holy door no longer answering, after their gaze saw only flesh and not soul, one haunting question remains. Can the light that once was be restored? If Eden is not merely a place, but a state of inner clarity, then is it possible for humanity, after falling from that state, to return? Not by foot, but by soul. Not by reversing time, but by journeying deep into the sacred memory once engraved within us. Jubilees chapter 4 answers, not with a promise, but with action. Because even after being cast out of Eden, Adam continued to keep the Sabbath. He still taught his children the laws and ordinances. He still lived within the order he had learned during those 7 years of light. Though he lost the garden, lost the vision, lost the sacred space, Adam did not completely lose the light. A part of the memory remained, a fragment of the light, though perhaps only embers, still burned within his soul. This is what makes Jubilees quietly but powerfully hopeful. Restoration does not begin with an external miracle, but with an inner faithfulness. Adam did not sit in sorrow. He built an altar. He offered sacrifices. He recorded the cycles of the years. He passed down what he had learned as the final teacher, still carrying Eden's curriculum. And that speaks to us. The light that once was, it has not vanished. It has been veiled, but it can be rekindled, not by rushed effort, but by the steady faithfulness of the heart. You don't need to understand everything. You only need to remember that you were once created in the light. In a world adrift between freedom and forgetfulness, the story of Adam after Eden becomes a sacred reminder. The fall is not the end of the story. It opens another journey, the journey of holding the light when there is no light left outside. And if Adam could do it, then so can you. If he, the first to lose everything, still remembered to keep the Sabbath, still taught his children what was right, then none of us is too late to begin again. That light never disappeared. It has only waited to be rekindled in each faithful breath, in each small action of a soul still turned toward the covenant. Not all light is extinguished. Some lights are not snuffed out. They are simply hidden, like a small flame covered in the ash of time, of wounds, of years of forgetting. But underneath it all, the fire still burns. And Jubilees whispers this truth. Within you, there still remains a part of Eden's light. The first 7 years in the garden, they do not belong only to Adam and Eve. They belong to all humanity, not as a private memory, but as a deep layer of the collective soul. We once lived in the light. We once understood the law. We once heard the voice of God echo each evening. We once looked at one another and saw soul, not just skin. We once lived in harmony with the trees, the wind, and the sacred rhythm of time. And though Eden has closed, its memory has never been taken. It is no longer present in space, but it remains in the soul, buried beneath the dust of wrong choices, of fear, of the habit of doing what contradicts our true nature. But that light, it never truly went out. Each right action you choose is a step in wiping away that dust. Each time you pause to listen instead of rushing to speak. Each morning you begin with gratitude instead of a sigh. Each week you give a day, not to do, but to remember who you are. That is not just morality. That is the resurrection of Eden's light within you. No one needs to find Eden as a location, because Eden is not on a map. It is in the structure of your soul, the deepest part still echoing the original light. You only need to uncover it again. You only need to choose to keep the law, not out of fear of punishment, but because you once knew it was right. You only need to live with order, not for success, but because your soul was once trained in that sacred order. Jubilees does not call you back to the past. It calls you back to a depth you never truly lost. That no one can give to you, but neither can anyone take it away. You have carried Eden within you. You still do. And now you only need to remember. You only need to rekindle it with one right action, one honest look, one breath that knows it lives in light, even when darkness surrounds. Because the first light is still waiting to be named again. We cannot return to Eden as a place, but we can live Eden again each time the soul awakens. Jubilees repeats what may seem simple. Time is not just a flow, but a cycle, and every cycle is a chance to remember, to renew, to return. Each week is not just 7 days, but a small circle of Jubilee. Every time you keep Sabbath, you are touching again the stream of the original light. You don't need angels to appear and guide you. You only need to stop. To live one day, not for productivity, not for acclaim, not for the race, but with the awareness that your presence in this world is part of a covenant. When you love without calculation, you live Eden again. When you forgive, even while your heart still aches, you take one step into the sacred garden now closed. When you look at someone, not just with your eyes, but with compassion, you glimpse a surviving ray of Eden's light. You don't need to be great. You only need one small, repeated choice, and you are living in the rhythm of the primordial light. And that light does not come from outside. It rises from deep within the place where you once knew who you were, where your soul was once named in a language you now only faintly recall in your deepest sleep. Jubilees does not offer you a magical door to reopen Eden, but it gives you each key, each act, each rhythm, each sacred habit, so that if you live rightly, you don't need to return to Eden by foot, because Eden has already risen within you. And the strange thing is, the more rightly you live in the present, the clearer Eden appears. Not as a mythical land, but as a sacred layer of reality unfolding again, through the way you love, you rest, you preserve, you choose rightly when no one is watching. You don't need to return to Eden. You only need to return to yourself, when you were still radiant. And from there, each awakened day is a day you have restored a piece of the sacred garden within your own soul. You don't need to turn back time. You only need to enter the present, with light preserved. If Adam, who once heard the voice of God clearly, who once lived in full light, who kept Sabbath and knew the law from the beginning, could still fall, that should not make you despair. It should make you humble, because it tells us light, no matter how brilliant, still needs guarding. No soul is immune to forgetting. No righteous one is guaranteed to stand firm without daily awakening. But if the light can be lost, it can also be kept, not by your own strength, but by the quiet, steady, honest faithfulness of the heart. The journey you are on is not the journey to find Eden as a place long closed. It is the journey to keep the light within yourself when the world outside is no longer clear. It is the journey of every human after Eden, how to keep the light from going out, even while living in an age that has lost so much. You do not need to be perfect. You only need not forget. Not forget that the light can still remain if you choose to keep it day by day, action by action, breath by breath. That is your Eden, not Eden lost, but Eden preserved within the soul that stays awake. You don't need to change the whole world. You don't need to begin with something grand. Light, in the tradition of Jubilees, does not ignite like blazing fire from heaven. It begins with one small act, one steady rhythm, one repeated choice. Adam, after leaving Eden, still kept the Sabbath. No more angels beside him, no more light in his eyes, but he kept the seventh day, because he remembered, and because he knew if anything could reconnect him to Eden, it would be the smallest faithfulness. And so can you. You don't need to understand the whole Bible. You don't need a vision. You don't need soaring emotion. You just need to choose one thing and keep it as a spiritual anchor in the swirl of this age. Maybe it's one day a week when you stop working, just to be still and remember who you are. Maybe it's a blessing you speak each morning to someone you love, even if no one asks. Maybe it's a pause before a word, just to ask, will this word keep the light? Choose one small thing and keep it, not to prove anything, but to keep the light from going out in you. Because light doesn't need to be loud, it needs to be kept. Eden didn't close because you weren't strong enough. It closed because you stopped living in the rhythm of the light. And that same rhythm can bring you back, not through miracle, but through the perseverance of a soul that still remembers. And if there's one thing you carry with you after this video, let it not be information. Let it be an invitation. Choose one small thing and keep it, as Adam kept the Sabbath. That is where the light begins, not from the mountain peak, but from a quiet soul that says, I remember I was created in the light, and I will live so as not to forget it. Begin, not for the outcome, but for the truth that the light still remains and is waiting for you to rekindle it each week, each day, each time you choose rightly when no one is watching. That is Eden, awakening again in you. Amen.